G'day brothers and sisters. Well, today we're looking at the parable of the shrewd manager. It's one of my favorite parables, but it's a real head scratcher to try to understand exactly what its meaning is. But the parable begins with these words. There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot be manager any longer." The rich man in this story, as we see the parable's details unfold, is the equivalent of a multi-millionaire or a billionaire by our standards. He's one of these big business tycoons. And it was common in Jesus' day for these types of rich people, people with such lavish wealth, to actually hire managers or chief stewards to manage their business affairs. And the responsibility of this manager in this story is to go around to the different estates that the rich man owns and collect a share of the produce. What typically happened in Jesus' day is if you were a rich property owner, you would rent out your land to tenant farmers. Now, how these tenant farmers repaid you was by giving you a share of their total produce. The manager's job was to go around each year and to examine the fields and to determine what share the owner should actually get from the tenant farmers. It was the job of the manager to take into account things like drought, things like natural disasters, things like the weather cycles to determine what was a reasonable amount to charge the tenant farmer for that year. Now, as the story unfolds, we see that this manager is accused of being unscrupulous with the rich man's affairs. There is no indication in the story that what the manager is doing is technically illegal or criminal, but certainly he's not being diligent in his duties. And as the story goes, it's determined by the rich man that he's going to remove the manager from his position. But before he can do that, the manager has to give an account. Now, this would not have been a quick termination meeting. What would have had to happen is the manager would have had to go away and collect all of his reports and collect all of the records he had kept for that year's produce. So he would have had to go away to all the different tenant farms and collect information so he could go back to the rich man and show whether or not he had been genuine or diligent in his collection of what the rich man was entitled. And as you can imagine, as this story is fleshed out, when you have managers who are appointed by rich owners and business tycoons to determine how much produce should be given back to them in terms of rental income, this type of business affair could be rife with sort of corruption, because you could take bribes, you could deliberately lower the amount that a tenant had to repay back to the landlord. And that's what seems to be happening in this story. This man seems to not be carrying out his duties effectively. So he has to give an account. And this is what it says happened. The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg." Digging was the job of slaves in the ancient world. It was typically associated or jobs given to slaves who didn't really have any skills or any trades. So this manager, having had the high executive position, he doesn't want to resort to being just a common slave here. Neither does he want to be a poor person and beg. So he is crafty. He says, "I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, "How much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 100. So when you look at the features of this story, this manager is actually quite clever in what he does. He goes around to each of his master's tenants and reduces the amount of rent or produce they have to pay back to the rich man. And his idea is that if I scratch their back, they're going to have to scratch my back when I lose my job. Typically, the manager of a rich man's household or his affairs would actually live in the property of his master or of his employer. So this man, rather than resorting to being out on the streets, he knows if he does a quid pro quo, if he does a favor for some of his master's tenants, then they have to owe him a favor in return. And reciprocity was very, very important in the ancient world. People were expected to pay back their debts to people, and they were expected to pay back their favor if they owed somebody. And look at the cleverness of this manager. He goes to the first man, and the first man owes 900 gallons of olive oil. Now, Jesus is intentionally speaking in hyperbole. The language is quite dramatic. He's really referring to somebody who owes a fair bit. 900 gallons of olive oil would have been equivalent to about the produce of 150 olive trees. So this man owes basically the produce of about 150 olive trees worth of produce. So it's a lot here. It would have been roughly equivalent. Some scholars have done estimates saying that it would have been roughly the equivalent of about 1,000 denarii, which would be about 1,000 days worth of labor. And what does the manager say? He gets him to cut the bill in half and says, instead of you owing 900 gallons, you now only owe 450. With the second one, he drops it by 20%. It says that the man owes 1,000 bushels of wheat. A bushel was a measuring unit. It was like a barrel where you would chuck grain into it. And this man owes about 1,000 barrels of wheat. Remember, the purpose of this arrangement was to encourage people to be productive. The more you grew, the more you would ultimately get back for yourself, having paid what you owed to your rich landlord. So what does he do? He takes 20% off and he says, well, instead of you now owing 1,000 barrels, you now only owe 800 barrels. And again, the numbers are really hyperbolic. Jesus is really setting up and juicing the amount of wealth that this rich man has, because 1,000 bushels of wheat would have been comparable to basically what would have been produced by 100 acres. So it's quite a lot that is being owed here, and the amount that the manager is discounting what the tenant has to pay back to the landlord is quite significant. Now again, I want to stress that technically speaking, although what this manager is doing is immoral and it's not really in the best interest of his rich employer, nothing is actually technically illegal. The manager was responsible for determining how much produce had to be paid back to landlords from the tenants. So he's doing everything which is technically within his power. And then it goes on to say, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Now this is quite amazing what's actually happened here. The master actually commends his manager, even though he's been ripped off. The reason why the rich man commends his manager is not because he's happy about being ripped off. Jesus in no way is condoning the actions of the manager. But the reason why the rich man commends the manager is because he recognizes that what the man did was actually very clever. He knew he was losing his job. So he set up arrangements to make sure that his best interests would actually be fulfilled after he lost his job. And what's remarkable about this whole thing is because the manager had discounted what was owed by these tenants, the rich man actually would be viewed in the public's eyes as a very generous benefactor, a kind landlord. So what had actually happened is, even though this manager had acted not in the best financial interest of the landlord, he'd actually built public honor for his landlord, for the rich man. Because now in the eyes of the public, everyone's going to look at him and say, oh, look at how generous this man is. Look at how well he treats his tenants, those who work parts of his estate. So the landlord actually gets his honor, his cultural honor, his reputation in the community is boosted. Yes, his bank account is less, but his public honor, which would have meant more to him than the amount of money he actually had, is actually the thing that gets boosted here. So this is such an amazing story. And then Jesus goes on to say, ultimately, For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. There's really two lessons we can deduce from this parable. And these are not interesting lessons to deduce because it's a really difficult parable to try to understand, but these points are definitely there. Number one, Jesus is saying that people in the business world act shrewdly when it comes to their best interests and the best interests of their stakeholders. That's what the manager really does. He acts in his best interests. And even though financially it wasn't in the best interest of the rich man, ultimately because his public reputation was boosted, in the long run it was better for him. And what Jesus is saying is that if people in this world, people who are perishing, can act wisely and can act shrewdly. Remember, what is shrewdness? Shrewdness is to be savvy, to be intelligent, to make good decisions. He says if people in this world can do that, how much more should the people of the kingdom act with wisdom and with intelligence, and how much more should we act shrewdly when it comes to affairs of the kingdom? I've said this multiple times, but I repeat, Jesus is he's not condoning the actions of the manager in this story. The manager does act unethically, but there was a common teaching mechanism in Jesus' day called kal vachomer. And kal vachomer literally means light and heavy. The point of this teaching mechanism is really to say, how much more? If X is true, how much more is Y? And the point Jesus is making is that if people of this world can act in witty and in shrewd ways so that their best interests are ultimately achieved, how much more should people of the kingdom act with shrewdness and intelligence and with wiliness when it comes to managing the affairs of God's kingdom? He's not saying that we should ever do anything unethical, but what he is saying is just like people of this world, when it comes to money and possessions, they act shrewdly. People of the kingdom, even more so, should act with intelligence and with sound decision making when it comes to boosting the honor of God, who is our creator. And then the second point of this story is what Jesus goes on to say. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with very much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with very much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly affairs, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The word that Jesus used is mammon. Literally, the word mammon was an Aramaic word which was basically personifying money or riches as if it was a pagan deity. And what Jesus is saying is he's saying that in the story, the manager, although he acted shrewdly, he was ultimately dishonest with his master's wealth and with the rich man's wealth. And his point is that as people of the kingdom, we cannot be dishonest with what God has given us. We must be trustworthy servants. When God gives us a task, when God gives us giftings and talents, we must use those giftings and talents to boost God's honor in the public's eye, to bring people into the kingdom. Otherwise, if we're not trustworthy with what we do have will be taken away. So it's a difficult parable, brothers and sisters, to get right, but I encourage you to read it a couple of times, to meditate on it and to sort of re-watch what I've said, because I think it's a wonderful parable and it's one of the most amazing parables Jesus tells, because it's really difficult to unpack. But God bless you, brothers and sisters, and we'll see you next time.